to show up into 10 concentration camps, American style. And then for Japanese Americans who loved this country and loved the idealism of the Constitution, had adopted American religions and philosophies and ideas, they felt it was great haji. In Japanese that means shame, but not a shame that they had earned. It was a shame that was imposed on them, that for 50 years they bore until this country, in 1987, finally apologized. They had to declare, even though they knew they were Americans, that they were as good as anybody. How many of you remember those notices? You were young and old. How many had businesses? You're asking your mother or your father, why do we have to do this? And sometimes your mother or father would say, shikata ga nai, what can you do? I remember the story of Nisei who told me, I volunteered from the camps because of something my father told me. When we went to Santa Anita racetrack, they gave us Seabiscuit's horse stall, and there was still manure, still laying in there, and they wanted us to live there. And my father, who had been a grower, he said, son, you have to look on the bright side. This will pass. Remember the Japanese saying that a lot of good may grow out of horse manure. And for the Japanese Americans, they were able to overcome largely by the war reputation of the 442nd and the 522nd. This is the Mochita family. These photographs were taken by the U.S. government to show that no harm was being done to Japanese Americans, that nobody was being hurt. There was no reaction. There was no protest. They went, and they went as honest American citizens to show that they were doing this for the war effort to support the government. There were 3 men that protested initially. The eyes say it all. If some of these images remind you of the roundups in Poland and Lithuania and Greece and Hungary, they're meant to do that. There's a dangerous non-citizen called an abunai, dangerous in Japanese. And the railroad stations and the trucks, and to the camps that you went to, dusty and hot, boiling hot in the summer with dust storms and food that you were not familiar with, freezing cold, tar paper barracks, the wind blew through in the sand, and you felt shame, and you felt your parents' shame, a father who was the head of the household reduced to living off the welfare of the government against his will. Many nervous breakdowns, sadness, and depression. Many families would never recover from this. And Issei mother, except being separated from her husband. And the barbed wire, everywhere barbed wire, American citizens behind barbed wire, without due process. Most people don't know it, but J. Edgar Hoover in Army intelligence and Navy intelligence said there was no need to intern Japanese Americans, there's no military necessity. But a few men in the military said maybe there is. And a handful of men, for whatever racial prejudice or whatever hate they had in their hearts, made 120,000 people disrupt their lives for 3.5 years. J. Edgar Hoover didn't need to do it, he said. The U.S. government still do it. For 3.5 years, barbed wire and separation and the shame. This photograph was taken by Ansel Adams. He used to taking pictures of beautiful mountains and skylights, but this was no beautiful place. Mud, no paved roads, very little plumbing, no privacy. This is a son visiting his mother just before internment. Last harvest of strawberries in Florida, California. This is inside of an American internment camp. Each of these mothers had 4 soldiers serving in the 442nd, and yet their mothers were languishing. And I asked the Nisseis, why were you the most decorated unit? For our mothers, for our brothers, for our sisters, for our unborn children. We knew we'd have kids someday. We knew that we wanted to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and professionals, but America wouldn't accept us. How many Nisei out there had gone to college and gotten your degrees and nobody would hire you? So you worked in your family grocery or on your farm. But you knew that you wanted your kids to be what they wanted to be. Because you served well, because you became the most decorated unit, the camps were closed down, and your children, probably your greatest pride in life, are doctors and lawyers and are the things that you wanted to be. And through them, you are living your lives. And because of Gaman, like the Sugiharas, you haven't told your children. This is James Carrara visiting his family in camp in Rower, Arkansas. He's one of the liberators. Jerome, Arkansas, more 522nd veterans training in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. It was interesting, when the Niseis went to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, it was a segregated camp because it was deep in the south of Hattiesburg, and the town council and the government didn't know what to do. Were the Niseis going to use the white bathrooms or the black bathrooms? Which restaurants were they going to eat in? The town decided that they would make the Niseis honorary white people. Could eat in the white restaurants. But the Niseis were angry at segregation. The Buddha heads from Hawaii and the Katonks from the mainland said, we've never seen this kind of prejudice against black people. Segregation? So oftentimes they would take over a bus that was segregated and allow the black soldiers to sit in the front seats. So they had a social consciousness. And when the news from the front came home, came to the sisters and the brothers and the daughters, the families, on behalf of a grateful nation is what the telegrams read. 614 families heard that terrible, terrible news. Some families lost 4 sons. Some died not knowing that their parents might never get out of an internment camp. I spoke to Reverend Higuchi, who was the chaplain of the 522nd. Many of you 522nd veterans knew he was greatly beloved. He was from Hawaii. He didn't see the camps till he got to the mainland, and he said the thing that most impressed him was when he would hear that a soldier who had just been killed, who he was saying a prayer over, and he would take the wallet out and the papers, and he would open it up and he would read the family had been interned, and this young man was lying dead in front of him, not knowing what the outcome of the war, the outcome of the family. He said that was the greatest tragedy. He says that no greater love hath a man than he would give his life for his family, or his friend, or his family. And the 522nd Field Artillery trained, set all kinds of records, as did the 442nd, for marching, for shooting. They proved to the Army that they could go for broke. And at first the Army wanted to make them service of supply, quartermaster troops. But because their training record was so good, they allowed them to go overseas and fight with Mark Clark in the 442nd. The 522nd Artillery could fire each cannon about 12 rounds a minute with pinpoint accuracy, and they were requested and served as firing batteries for over 500 units overseas in Germany and Italy. And many a time that they got their brothers in the 442nd out of space by providing overhead cover. Mark Clark, interestingly enough, was the only general standing on the right who would accept the Niseis in combat overseas. Eisenhower wouldn't, Patton, Bradley, all the major commanders except for the Pacific. We think that we know why, because he was in the secondary front. But I think I know, I had talked to him before he passed away. I said, why? He said, because I knew they were innocent. I knew that what happened to them was wrong. He grew up on the West Coast. He was against the internment. He testified on behalf of the Niseis, saying the internment was not necessary. And when he took his Niseis, he said, and we have 2 quotes from him saying, they were the best goddamn fighters I had in the whole 5th Army, and Mark Clark commanded almost 1 million men in the Mediterranean theater. He said, whenever I needed to get something done, I would send the 442nd in. They never took a step backwards. When I talked to him, I found out that Mark Clark was Jewish, interestingly enough. Go for broke was the motto. It was a Hawaiian gambling term. It meant go for all or nothing. Throw the works, shoot the works. The original motto for the 522nd was, you'll never believe this, be faithful and loyal. Something you might tell your dog. The men said, no, that's not our motto. We are faithful and loyal. We're going for broke. That became their motto. The original symbol of the 442nd was a yellow hand with a dagger stabbing down, dripping blood. It was called a stab in the back in Sugihara. And one of the commanding officers of the 442nd said, "That's a terrible slight to these men. You can't do that." And they each signed their own patch. You know what the patch was? It was the torch of freedom from the Statue of Liberty. Go for broke and freedom. Men of Charlie Battery. Innocent boys, 19, 20, 21. Barely had girlfriends. Maybe hadn't even kissed. Gone overseas to see the world for the first time. Not expecting to see a concentration camp or war, but fighting for their brothers and their sisters and their mothers and fathers. They fought in 8 campaigns, won 8 presidential unit citations. One campaign that they fought in, they took a mountaintop, and they did with about 2,000 men what 60,000 men couldn't do in 6 months. They took a hill in Italy and won their 8th presidential unit citation, which was given to them directly by Harry Truman. This was their campaign that defined the Nisei experience in the military. A group of Texas soldiers, about 300 of them, had got caught in a German trap. And they were serving with the 36th Texas Division. And this unit had this entire battalion cut off. It was called the Lost Battalion, or the Fight for the Rescue of the Lost Battalion. And the entire division of 14,000 men couldn't rescue their own Texas soldiers. So the commanding officer of the 36th Division said, "I would like the Niseis to try to do that." So they took 2,000 men and they fought for 9 days through unpregnable forests in the Black Forest in the Vosges Mountain. And in those days they took almost 100% casualties, rescuing the 300 men. They won 2 presidential unit citations and rescued the Lost Battalion. And we talk about earning citizenship as Americans. Those Texas soldiers said, "Without them, I'd be dead." And in 1962, Governor Connolly declared all the Japanese American soldiers to be honorary Texans, Americans and Texans. This is that mountain. This is that road to freedom for the children. Up hills, Germans had been there. In fact, I had read that this forest, in France it's called the Vosges, in Germany it's called the Black Forest, had never been conquered, not by Charlemagne, not by Napoleon, not by Hannibal. None of the great commanders had never been able to invade Germany through France through this mountain. It was impossible. But the 442nd, leading the entire 7th Army at Bruyères and Bifontaine, broke through this forest and reduced the German forces and led the force and the army into Germany. It was literally the 442nd that made the breakthrough. It was unbelievable. This is the funeral for the men who were killed, the 2,000 casualties, the men that were killed. Colonel Miller, many of you remember him. Colonel Hanley, still living, 90 years old. He said the men finally earned a large chunk of America with their blood. Colonel Hanley and Colonel Miller were yelled at on that day. You know where they were yelled? They were yelled at by the commanding officer of the 36th Division. He said, "I want to honor you people. Where is your unit? Where is all the soldiers that you were supposed to have for this honor?" And Colonel Hanley and Colonel Miller, crying, told him, "You know, sir, I don't think you realize, but this is all the men we have left. Out of 6,000 men in the regiment, only the anti-tank company, with less than 200 people, could stand up and walk and appear on that parade." That's the anti-tank company. You can see by the expressions on their face what war does to a person. At the same time, in Kaunas, Lithuania, those young Jewish men who were on a trajectory to meet the Niseis in those snow-covered fields of Waldkirch in Bavaria were being rounded up. About 94% of the Jews of Lithuania were put in ghettos, starved to death, deported to the 5 major camps, 94%. And there were over 140,000 Jews in Lithuania, and less than 10,000 survived. But if you look at the pictures, trucks, baggage, belongings, faces, confusion, Do they look like the War Relocation Authority photographs taken by Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange and Clem Albers and Russell Lee? They do. The ultimate destination was different. Those were the destinations of Auschwitz-Birkenau. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, nearly 2 million people were killed. On a very bad day, in the summer of 1944, as many as 26,000 people could be killed in that place. Their bodies cremated, disposed of, and they would vanish forever from Earth. Selection. Dr. Mengele, a man of medical science, he asked to say those who would live, those that, in violation of every oath of humanity and Hippocratic oath. As I said, 1,500,000 children were killed, innocent children in the Holocaust. But things they could have invented, things they could have done. For the Lithuanian survivors, it meant working in Germany in airplane factories, building factories, assembling German aircraft. They lived in rude little forest encampments where the average life expectancy, if you were in a German work camp, a labor camp, of the Landsberg-Kaufering area was approximately 4 months. In the 1 year that these camps were in existence, about 95% of the people were killed, the Jewish laborers. The Jews were pretty much separated from the main camp of Dachau, and the Jewish survivors, most of them working here, were either Lithuanian or Hungarian. At the end of the war, Hitler wanted to erase all traces of the Holocaust, so the last 10,000 survivors of the Landsberg-Kaufering, or the Jewish camps of Dachau, were ordered to be marched into Austria, where they were to be murdered in the Bavarian Alps. This is a map that was recreated showing the death march that started on April 24th, 1945. And it started out with a little more than 10,000 people and wound up with about 6,000 people. So on the 6 or 7 days that they marched 60 miles, almost half of those people, slightly less than half people, were killed in those 4 days. And the Jewish survivors who described that death march from those 10 labor camps was unbelievable. They were already starved into practically inhumanity. There are 5 known photographs of the death march that were taken by a German pharmacist. These are the actual photographs of the death march in Dachau. These are the men that the Nazis would rescue. They were mostly Lithuanian, a few Hungarian Jews. They'd been marching for 7 days. These are the men who would be the men who, of the 6,000 that survived, the Nazis would save. How many people have not heard this story before? Raise your hand. How many times the first time? It's unbelievable. Even the Jewish survivors had been looking for the Nazis. They never even discussed it with their children for a lot of more complex reasons. But look at their faces, emaciated faces. If you fell down, the German guards would kill you. A dog might tear you to pieces. They would shoot you. They would beat you. They had wooden shoes in which they had to march day after day. They existed on less than 500 calories a day. One tiny piece of bread, moldy margarine, maybe some potato peel soup if you were very lucky. You couldn't escape. There was no escape. The Nazis talked about their eyes. If you couldn't leave the camps, the Jewish camps of Kaufering and Landsberg near Dachau, they were murdered by machine gun fire, and most of the bodies were burned with flamethrowers. These soldiers that you see liberating the camps that the Jews just left 2 or 3 days earlier were ironically members of the Lost Battalion, or members of the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry, which I think is unbelievably ironic. So it was the Texas soldiers that liberated Landsberg and Kaufering, and their faces sort of say everything. There was a few trains that were being taken from Dachau to also to Wackerschen, and the Germans starved or killed the people in the train. Over 3,000 people were killed on this train. This train, after the Jewish victims had been killed, It was liberated also by the Niseis about 2 days before they liberated the main camp. About 5 days before they liberated the main camp of Dachau, the Nisei had entered Germany. They'd entered Germany about March of 1945, and within about a month and a half, they found the German army had pretty much capitulated. There was virtually no fighting, and thousands of German prisoners had literally surrendered to them. They took away their weapons and sent them home. They captured a German airfield outside of Munich. Those airplanes were the experimental German Tu-62 Messerschmitts. This is the first sign Japanese Americans were literally be coming upon Dachau. They'd never heard of Dachau. They'd never heard of German concentration camps. The army had never briefed them. But they had seen some atrocities as they were traveling through Germany. Just before they entered the main camp, advanced patrols had attached with the 20th Armored Division. These are Nisei attached to the 20th Armor, entering the main village of Dachau. It was these men that you see in this picture, the men of the advanced patrols of the wire services, and the men of the spotting would go into the main camp of Dachau. We think anywhere from 20 to 50 men from the 442nd entered the main camp of Dachau. The main camp of Dachau had existed since 1933, and about 250,000 people had been killed there in the 13, 12 years that it existed. The part of the camp that they entered was the upper left part of the camp that ironically contained this part where the trees are, the crematoria, the ovens, gas chambers. This is the crematoria building. This is a photograph taken by the Niseis on the day of liberation. Pictures of the ovens, gas chambers, the bodies outside the gas chambers. They could never forget those scenes. Many of the men were wounded for life at what they saw. It left an impression that they could never tell their kids or their wives or their children. And the happy prisoners that they saw, people who they also saved. Tadashi Tojo, subcamp of Dachau. Dachau had 600 subcamps. Niseis entered several of these subcamps. One of the subcamps that people who had just been recently executed. The death march went through dozens of towns. These 6,000, 7,000 men walked through all these towns, including Munich. So the thousands of German people who had known about the Holocaust had a first-hand experience of the murder. So they had to give them milk or soup or pancakes or powdered eggs. Survivors simply couldn't keep food down. This is an extremely rare, extremely important photograph. It shows the Niseis Jeep, 522nd Field Artillery. The commanding officer, Colonel Harrison's Jeep, outside the barracks that was established, a field hospital for survivors of Dachau by the Niseis. And they brought these men back from the brink of death. They brought them into life. They were saved on May 1st, 1945. Clarence Matsumura was one of those men who worked for 3 days, and he told me, actually a survivor told me who remembered Clarence, that Clarence worked so hard for those 3 days that he fainted from exhaustion and not eating, and they had to resuscitate him. The little town of Wacker, not even on the German maps. These are survivors saluting the Niseis as they were leaving. Grateful men who would then rebuild their lives and have children. Ironically, the mission of the 522nd was to capture Berchtesgaden, Hitler's stronghold, along with the 101st Airborne Division. And the Niseis, most people don't know this, were the first Allied troops to capture Berchtesgaden, Hitler's headquarters. These are photographs of Hitler's and Göring's home. And they were there with the frontline troops. They were there on May 5th, 1945. These are the Niseis in Hitler's house. This is a famous picture when Hitler is always pictured looking out at the Alps, making his plans to conquer the world. And here are the Niseis of Charlie Battery, A Battery, B Battery, Headquarters Battery, and Service Battery, saying that was not to be so. Those men with the hollow eyes, those anonymous men, the Niseis, never really heard their names or knew what happened, but they grew up, they became fleshed out, they had children, many children. They became the leaders of post-war Israel. They ironically couldn't go back to Kaunas. They couldn't go back to Poland. They couldn't go back to Hungary. They didn't want them home. Sounds a little bit like in California here, where your neighbors didn't want you home. There was Jews not wanted. Jews go home. Jews were massacred as they made their way home. 50 here, 100 there. These are the ruins of Kaunas. These people couldn't stay. There are no Jews in Lithuania today. There was once 3 million Jews in Poland. There's less than 5,000 today. And to Israel. These are the men who the Nisei saved. After 50 years, this is May 1st, 1995. We were in Germany. This is the site of where they were liberated by Nisei. 60 men went back, and I took these photographs, and behind them is the monument of the Death March that honors them for surviving and the Niseis for liberating them. That's the actual area, that's the actual site of that little town of Waghkirchen, where the Niseis rescued 6,000 people. And like Sugihara, have really gotten no recognition. There is no books, there are no articles, there are no films. One small documentary that was done a few years ago. I ask yourself, why is that? And returning to that field. And I asked those men, how does it feel on the 50th anniversary to be there on that spot? And a few Japanese Americans, including Clarence Matsumura last year. You know what the Japanese Americans said? The Japanese Americans said, I am so happy to be with you and to be with you in this moment. And the Jewish survivors said, this is the second happiest day of my life. And all I ask you is to tell other people about it, and to continue this story, and to honor the Niseis. And remember, if you have children who are the sons and daughters of the Niseis, and we have some 522nd veterans, and as I think of it, I'd like to ask all the 522nd and the 442nd veterans and the veterans of the Pacific to please stand up and be recognized.
Thank you, Eric. That was very timely because I was going to suggest we all stand up and get a stretch. No, we don't have to do that. We have a special treat, the last segment of our program today. In the weeks we had to perform, to put together this program, Stan Morita, public affairs producer for Channel 24, excuse me, Stan. Channel 47 KJEO. That's Channel 47 KJEO. And our committee chair, Joy Vincent-Killian, found, interviewed, and put together a videotape oral history. And I think you will all agree that this is a treasure for us. This is about 10 minutes of over 2 hours of oral history that was taken. I'd like to introduce Stan Morita and Joy Vincent.
The other gentleman, Kiyoshi Imoto from Lindsay. Please stand. Now, I don't know if this next gentleman was able to make it today. I talked to him this morning. He said he would try. From Fresno, Kane Umamoto. Kane, are you here today? Okay. And our from Fresno, our last guest is Tom Wayoka. Tom, please stand. Now, we tried our very best in a short time to locate as many of the Central Valley veterans in the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, but we apologize if we did leave anybody out that some of our audience members may know of. But as I said earlier, we are greatly indebted to these gentlemen, these fine men. And as a member of the Japanese American community, I want to thank you. I am able to do what I do because of your efforts.
At this point, we'd like to open up for question and answer, or question and comments.
Why are you moving your thing?
Yash, Toro, would you like to come up if anybody has any questions for you? You know, this has been a long program, and Lanny and Eric and our people and the soldiers, if there are any questions or comments, if you'd like to ask them. I know when we were having this committee meeting, Bobby Malone came in and just sat down and was interested, and he said, you know, I was there in Germany, and he ran an army hospital. And he said, I was in charge of these guys from the 442nd. And he says, it was terrible. They kept going AWOL. And I was responsible for saying where they were. He said, and I couldn't figure out where they were all going. Almost all of them, they'd come in with frozen feet, a serious malady, and they were disappearing. He says, but later we found out where they were going. They were all going AWOL from the hospital and rushing back to join their units and their buddies to go on with the fighting. And those are the kind of comments that we've been getting about contact with these wonderful heroes. Okay, let's go on. Now there has been a symbolism here with the darkness of the past, and then we opened it up to the light of the future. And while it's in some of your eyes, I hope you appreciate it. We've only had a couple weeks to plan this. I'd like to acknowledge not only Linda Calandra, who is here, but Juan Arangula, who came as one of our elected officials. Juan, are you still here? He was here. We also received a special treat this morning, and this is the fastest I've ever seen the United States government. Except when they wanted to arrest one of my clients. And I'd like to say, Stan Marita, Channel 47, on your side, KGO. I know I'm going to be back on that station in about the year 2010. Senator Feinstein delivered this morning through Ken Price, the representative, a beautiful leather-bound, silk-bound certificate of commendation from the United States Senate. It says the certificate of commendation is hereby presented by Dianne Feinstein, United States Senator from California, to the Central Valley Jewish and Japanese American Forum in recognition of its remembrance of Chiune Sugihara in the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, and for its continuing efforts to educate and inform the community. Thank you very much, Senator. The Holocaust Oral History Project has helped put on this presentation today. We hope that you were moved by today's presentation. I'm sure you were. And that you share our belief that these important stories must be kept alive and taught to all of our fellow citizens. As I said before, education is a primary goal of the Jewish and Japanese American Forum of the Central Valley. We especially want to educate the students in our community about these important stories. The Holocaust Oral History Project has offered to help us by preparing a curriculum for our local schools about the Japanese American internment, the honor and bravery of the soldiers who left these camps to fight for freedom, and their ironic liberation of the Jewish victims of the greatest horrors in history. The Holocaust Oral History Project will also continue its production of educational materials regarding the story of Mr. Sugihara and the evacuation of the Japanese Americans. We need your help. We need your help to produce these educational curriculum and videos. Simply put, we need money. We need money to do this. All the hard work and all the good intentions in the world won't get the job done if we don't have the money to get these materials produced, accepted in our local schools, and distributed to them. I would like to thank all of you who have been so generous in donating money, food, services, and other things for today's program. I also want to thank all of you who showed up yesterday and today to help us prepare the food for the social hour, do all the physical things. I want to thank Travis Leachy, who has seen none of this show, who's been behind us working these machines. We've got 2 different machines here. Everything that could have gone wrong yesterday did, and Travis has put on a flawless show, and I want to thank you. There are so many people who have done so much. Travis is the governor, the head of all the Japanese American Citizen Leagues in the Central California district. We had to print this program on Tuesday. Since that time, we've had other people who have been very generous. I'd just like to take a second and name them. Helen Hasegawa, Dr. Izumi and Barbara Taniguchi, Ben and Hisako Nakamoto, Ken Tanaguchi, Nori Masuda, the Central California Nikkei Foundation, Arlene and Ken Yakoda, the Clovis Japanese American Citizens League, and the 442nd and 100th Infantry Battalion MIS Triad Memorial Highway Association, and PG&E, who has become a Golden Circle sponsor. I'd like to thank all of these people for their generosity. And now I ask all of you to contribute what you can to this effort. There are envelopes and boxes. There are envelopes in your program. There are boxes in the back of the room. Please do what you can to help us keep these stories alive. If we keep them alive, those people who say they didn't happen will never prevail. I'd like to introduce at this time